Well, that didn't take very long. The first layoffs of 2025 have already been announced, and Meta is leading the charge. And they've announced that they're going to be laying off low performers. And so I want to dive into what this means and how it could potentially impact the rest of the tech market and the broader market in general. But before we get into that, if you're interested in more career-related content just like this directly from our corporate recruiter, make sure you hit that subscribe button. You may also want to hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future content. So if you haven't paid attention to the latest news cycle, Mark Zuckerberg just recently announced that he is going to be laying off 5% of Meta's workforce, but he's going to be specifically targeting a singular group, and that is the low performers on the totem pole. And in this memo, he references or foreshadows that it's going to be an intense year in 2025 to be an employee at Meta. So let's take a quick look at what this memo said and how it's going to impact people at Meta and beyond. So the headline reads that Meta is going to be cutting 5% of its lowest performers. So Mark Zuckerberg released this memo saying that he is aiming to cut 5% of what he calls his lowest performers with plans. Now this is what's interesting here, with plans to backfill those roles later this year, the company confirmed on Tuesday. And even after the massive layoffs that they had in 2022 and 2023, they're still left with 7,200 people in their workforce. So this is going to equate to around 3,600 people that could potentially be impacted by this. So in the memo, he says, I've decided to raise the bar on performance management and move out low performers faster. And he continues that we typically manage people out who aren't meeting expectations over the course of the year. So this is in the form of like performance improvement plans, so PIPs. If you're somebody that gets into a performance improvement plan, you're typically put on it at some point in the year, and they manage you out of the business over time. I mean, that's essentially what the performance improvement plan is. But he clarifies that now we're going to be doing more extensive performance-based cuts during this cycle. So these are performance-based layoffs. Now, the announcement comes at a period of turmoil and rapid policy change for Zuckerberg. And if you recall, there's been some interesting shifts in their policies, in particular around fact-checking. So they're actually going to be getting rid of their fact-checking department. So I'm imagining all those positions will be caught up in that 5%. Not that they're necessarily low performers, but nonetheless, they probably will be wrapped up in that 5%. And he's also getting rid of some of their programs, like their DE&I programs are also going to be eliminated. So there is a lot of change that's happening over at Meta, and these layoffs are just the latest round in it. Now, some interesting things to note about these layoffs is the fact that he is labeling them performance-based. And this is decidedly different than the layoffs that happened in 2022, 2023. Now, on some level, I think we have to expect that people who are low performers are going to be tapped for layoffs sooner than somebody that's a strong performer in the same team. However, the layoffs that happened during that period of time were universally stated to be they just were no longer mission critical for the direction of the business. And I know it's kind of like corporate speak, but nonetheless, it's probably pretty true. There were a lot of really solid people who were laid off through no fault of their own. Their department was deprioritized, their role was deprioritized, the projects that they worked on were potentially shifted and no longer a point of emphasis for the company. And by no fault of their own, they just had nowhere to go. They were eliminated. And so you had a lot of people coming onto the market that, yeah, you have this, I guess, this stigma of being laid off, but you didn't have the stigma of performance necessarily. But with his specific wording of them being a performance-based layoff, that they are targeting people who are low performers. And in addition to that, they are also going to be backfilling those same positions. It's kind of damning for those people who are getting wrapped up in it. And unfortunately, in the tech space in particular, it's kind of incestuous. These companies tend to recruit from the same pool of people. There's a tier of, I guess you'd call them the FANG level, but then there's also a tier below that is, the companies like the Salesforces, like Adobe, et cetera, those kind of companies, which are also in big tech and they potentially have resources, but they're not necessarily that same tier. But those groups of companies tend to hire from the same pool of people in Silicon Valley. And so if Zuckerberg is labeling these people to be low performers, essentially he's placing a pretty damning scarlet letter on them that will likely follow them throughout the rest of their career. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that the person who gets wrapped up in a performance-based layoff will never get another job in the industry again, but I mean, it's going to make it decidedly more difficult to do so. But unfortunately, there are some biases there. I mean, I personally had an experience where a chief human resources officer for the company that I work for specifically going onto our Slack channels and stating that we know that Meta is doing a big layoff, and this was back in 2022, 2023-ish, because I know that they're doing a big layoff. We don't want to target any of their people because she said they're cutting the fat. They're cutting the low performers. So there was even a perception back then, even though it wasn't necessarily the case, that that was indeed what they were doing, that the people at Meta, I hate to use this, but basically they're damaged goods. And now you've got the CEO of Meta saying these are damaged goods. So it's an interesting choice of words. And unfortunately, it may have a deeper impact on the people who are affected by it. Now, the concept of layoffs based on performance is not a new thing. It's been happening in the big tech space for a long time. It's been happening in banking as well and other industries. In fact, Meta has a reputation of doing the same thing where they take the bottom 5% or 10% of their workforce, they basically exit them, and then they replace them with, they say, the top 10%. So they're in theory, you're always getting rid of your poor performers, and the rising tide kind of raises all ships, so to speak. So this is a very common concept that happened very frequently before 2020, but now it's being stated very publicly, and in fact, it's made press releases and it's gone all over the internet. But the bigger issue here is that typically when one company does it, other companies start to follow suit. And you notice that during the layoff cycles in 2020, it was like they were all waiting around for the first company to start announcing layoffs. And then once one did, literally everybody jumped on the bandwagon. So every company started laying off because they were no longer the first. They were no longer the bad guy in that regard. And so unfortunately, I think you're going to start to see more and more of these performance-based layoffs, at least being more visible, where companies are looking at more actively managing their workforces. And it's kind of like in a way, like a great reset where they had these wages that went way up during the 2021 job boom. And in some cases, they got inflated, especially in the tech space. There's some people that got pretty inflated salaries because there was bidding wars. And I think that this is potentially one of the ways that employers are trying to reduce wages, unfortunately, for everybody, is by forcibly exiting people whose salary doesn't necessarily match the output. Now, there's a lot of different ways that they'll look at your performance and whether or not you would be pulled into one of these performance-based layoffs. Of course, you got metrics, the dashboards, the numbers that are produced. And every big company, I worked at Amazon, it was very metric driven, and they could pull your numbers at any point in time, and they could see whether or not you were hitting the bar. And certainly they're paying close attention to it. Now, I'm sure at Meta, just about every position has verifiable metrics, and you should know whether or not you're hitting them or you aren't. But they're oftentimes making these very automated approaches where software is determining who gets onto a layoff list. And then you got some people behind a closed door somewhere that are going in and making the final decisions. But oftentimes it's being automated and flagged, especially at a company like Meta where you just have so many employees. How are they going to look through 72,000 people to determine what 35 or 3,600 people are going to be laid off? So it's often going to be based on pretty cutthroat metrics. And I think that there's going to be a lot of people who, you'll have managers who will try to go to bat for some of their employees, but oftentimes the manager won't even have a say-so in it. They'll often just get a list of people who are impacted in their departments, and then they just have to kind of deal with it. And unfortunately, they're the ones that sit in these meetings delivering the news that they don't want to deliver. So if you're somebody that works in the big tech space or potentially in banking or some other industries that have done this kind of thing in the past, now's the time to probably be buckling down and making sure that you're hitting your numbers and trying to keep your name off of any potential layoff list. But with the ever-evolving job market being what it is, we have to stay one step ahead. So this is the prime opportunity for you to assess your situation. Maybe think long and hard about if you want to go into the biggest ponds like the tech space and then with the FANGs and these companies that have high performance standards, and just really think about what you want in your career. But it's also time to start brushing up on your skills, making sure that you are as skilled today. So if you have to hit the open market, that you're able to do it with conviction and authority. And naturally, you don't want to get caught unprepared with not having an up-to-date resume or a resume that's effective. And this might be a great time to start revisiting and building those networks. So this news is not necessarily surprising, but it is going to probably become more commonplace going forward. Again, first company, first mover, you're probably going to see more companies follow suit. So time to buckle up a little bit. Now, the good news here is that in theory, this is something that you control. So if you're somebody that is slacking off, or your performance is weak, or your skills are weak, you can address that by acquiring the skills and maybe putting in a little bit more effort. But nonetheless, let's keep our eyes wide open. We want to act like the CEO of our career. But if you need more help in your career and your job search, that's something that I specialize in. Go to a website called lifeafterlayoff.com, loaded with tips and tricks, all from a recruiting insider's perspective. And I share my deepest and most intimate knowledge in the form of some training courses on resume writing, career strategy, job search strategy, how to negotiate offers, all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, networking, how to build an effective network that can actually help you get ahead in your career. So head over to my website to check those out if you want to get more information on those skills. Anyways, always appreciate you watching. We'll see you on the next one.